Welcome to the Ottawa International Writers Festival. Our 2020 virtual season is broadcasting from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe.
Hi everyone, welcome to this podcast with the Ottawa International Writers Festival and VerseFest here in Ottawa. I'm always happy to talk and hear A.F. Moritz, who is our special guest today. We're going to ask Al to do about a 10-minute reading or so to give us a taste of his new book, and then we'll have a good chat, I think. But first, a little introduction. For over 45 years, A.F. Moritz has been articulating and interpreting the frailties and fraught tensions of civilization, myth, history, love, war, and nature through a singular voice of profound compassion. And all you slackers might want to consider that he's written around 20 books of poetry. I haven't quite nailed down the exact number, as well as several books of translations and nonfiction. And his poetry has been honored with a number of distinctions, including the Guggenheim Fellowship, the Award in Literature of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, Poetry Magazine's Best Hogan Prize, and an Ingram Merrill Fellowship. He's also been a finalist for the Governor General's Literary Award 3 times, and he has won the Griffen Poetry Prize for his book, The Sentinel, as well as a Relit Award for Night Street Repairs. Al has been teaching at Victoria College at U of T for many years and is currently serving as the City of Toronto's Poet Laureate. His new book, published by House of Anansi Press, is called As Far As You Know. So please welcome Al Moritz.
Thanks a lot, David, and thank you, Sean. It's always wonderful to be at VerseFest and at the Ottawa Writers Festival, which I've been privileged to do 3 or 4 times, and I always love coming to Ottawa. I only wish I could actually be there now. That's a real delight. But I hope someday soon. Maybe you'll invite me back next year or something when things are different. But let me then read 4 or 5 poems and give a taste of this book. The first one I'm going to read is A Throw of the Dice. Well, it refers to and takes off from, in certain ways, the great long poem, one of the great modern poems by Stéphane Mallarmé, Un coup de dés n'abolira jamais le hasard, one which means a throw of the dice will never abolish chance. A throw of the dice will never abolish chance, but it does. You make your play, and there it lies, a 6. You lose. You lose this time forever. Chance is gone, replaced by fate, your destiny of stone. But you can pick them up again, those bones. Unabolished, chance makes its return. A phoenix from ashes, a mummy from the tomb, soaring above, striking terror all through what had obliterated it. Take courage, throw. You duck your head in prayer. For now, this while on the verge, there exists even luck. Good luck, bad luck, some kind of knack for attracting disaster or averting it. Now you've unfrozen, the cubes roll again, and this time 7 spots or 12, you win. And everything's back at rest. Everything always comes back to rest in fortune or despair, the way it is now, the only way things are. How can this deep freeze enclose and ever come to spout freedom and fear? You are the only ice, the only stake, the only dice. Every throw was one throw, or it still is. In the closed or open parlor, you are the mirror or the window. I notice with, some pleasure going back to this book that it contains poems of many different kinds. And I never really intended to write poems of many different kinds, but the poems adapted to the different sorts of occasions or inspirations they had. This one's a really different one. Names of birds. Awake at dawn, recalling my father crying, unable to go to sleep again, and soon the first bird sings. Despair when the first bird sings and the first light comes and you haven't slept. I curse myself. The many-noted melody is its signature, but I can't read its name. My father knew the name of every bird, every tree, bush, and grass they played in, every seed, bug, and worm they ate, their friend. I have lived to an age far past what he received, and I know nothing. Father, where are you, so I can ask you and have you give me the names? I always thought I'd take the time later to learn them from you. A scientist who used to say, names are only for people. Now I see birds have names, and he knew them, not just the nomenclature of kinds, the name of each one, a strange sort of word that exists only an instant, when the bird answers a man who whistles to it, and then goes silent, hoping to hear him again. This poem is called To Cross Over into Campfire, and that's a strange sort of title, but you might recognize that it's an allusion, a transformation of the famous line from the great old spiritual Deep River. Deep River, my home is over Jordan. Deep River, Lord, I want to cross over into campground. So this is into campfire. And you might say that the old hymn longs for rest, campground, a place where there'd be a meeting, where the slaves sometimes were allowed to go to see a religious revival meeting. And we today think of there being no rest, there being nothing but continual change and movement, so campfire rather than ground. To cross over into campfire. Once the fire has leapt upon its fuel, and we are sitting around it with our marshmallows skewered on sharpened sticks, and out beyond the veil of the border of glimmer and darkness, among the marshmallows at the swamp's edge, some frogs boom a humble love made solemnly and briefly in cold and darkness. The fire will not die. One half of it departs for the sky through its sharp, wavering point the way a word, part understood, part mistaken, part deeply welcomed, part a troubling, desperately refused, changes slowly in the digesting heart of the hearer. The other half moves horizontally into our happy chatter. Let it not be selfish. Let talk not forget all who have no fire tonight, as one day we will have no fire. We'll lie in the dullness, the last ember, in the third half of fire, the ash, with little left but the fire that fled above, the measure that went up from the flame tips to live in darkness, as cold points defining a wish that the happy elsewhere should not forget us. I'll read now Nazareth, which is again a very different kind of poem, a narrative poem, more a narrative poem, and a poem of reminiscence though, so it shares that with names of birds about my father. Nazareth. Nobody much knows we're here, my grandmother and me. Oh, my mother and father, who parked me with her for today, know it, and my sister and my brother, who went off with them. The town knows my family, builders and pavers with brick, so it knows vaguely that we are here, I am here. Some of the old people knew my grandfather, who founded the company, welcomed newcomers from Italy, saw to it that quickly they were citizens and voted, helped found a parish, a friendly and insurance society, was a bank director and a farmer. I know about him. Here's his Maranzano, though his ocarina's lost now, with the songs he'd sing on the stoop at evening. Here's the strawberry barrel that is from his time, and the great garage that was a barn of his not long before my birth. A corner of it was for his shoemaker's bench, his awls and disc-nosed hammers. The neighborhood knows we live here, and a few people all over town, but outside the town no one at all. Here I am by the sunny western stoop, by the peach tree, listening to the sparrows' excited debate under the vine leaves. In the vine-framed window, west side of the kitchen, Graham's making pizza dough. We're apart. We touch, each closed in a separate sphere, transparent with a shell that can't be felt, yet can't be walked through. Whenever she hugs me, the two coincide almost entirely. My circle of 7 years, hers of a powerful youth in old age, which with its treasures of far-come times and worlds that arrive in lightning sparkles from a half-opened chest. But now, not touching, far separate if close, both of us know, me seeing her through the screen, she at the counter absorbed in her work, that something great has happened with us, just this moment, a shattering we've felt together though apart, a vast and calm eruption beneath our feet and skin, beneath the bottoms of the wells of our hearts, under the earth, sky, and inmost center of everything. Out in the world, no one knows. No one knows that we are here. Do I have time to read one more, David? So I'll finish with this poem, Escape to the Sea. Once again, a very different kind of poem, Escape to the Sea. The ancient heroes longed only to stay home, or to roam across the sea. Did they fail to see, raised on the edge of the sea, wielding the sword edge, burning towers by the sea, burying comrades on the sea beaches, the blood in the rivers flowing down to the sea, weeping, roasting meat around fires next to the sea? The sea was their only home. The sea is no home to a man. Much wandering sours and estranges its heart. The sea is the desert, the living sea. Dead to a man, it will kill him with its fishes, its many fabulous citizens, its cold, its black twistings like his dreams, the vast expanses, little different ever, slowly shifting, the bitter storms come and gone, impossible to remember except as dread. The vast expanses and wandering them in the coffin hull, and soon not even his body is a home. It drifts, or he rows it threatened, or lets the sails drag it flying over the treacherous vastness that he is. If only I could live in a tiny house of sod and stone, a brief distance inland, and there my voice inside me could talk with her and with the land, so that when I grew stiff with dwelling and I walked and mounted the dunes, the sea would dawn as a great freedom, the clean billowing of the bedsheet, of the sail. Okay, that's it. 5 poems.
Thank you so much, Al. That's great. I want to discuss a little bit about the themes and some of the things that you're writing about in the new poems. But first I want to get a sense of maybe context of the writing of this book. In 2018, you published a fairly massive selected poems, The Sparrow. That was one event recently, and then of course, as you describe in your afterword, you had also had a heart surgery during the writing of this book. Can I get a sense of a timeline of when you were writing these poems? How far were you into this volume when you were compiling the selected, and also when you were dealing with the heart surgery?
Yeah, well, the heart surgery and its aftermath, and my thinking about it, the run up to it, um, cut through the 3 books, sequence a poem, which was my book, my uh, new book, a separate book of poetry before the selected poems. So that was 2015. That book came out. Then the selected poems was 2018, and then it also affected this book, As Far as You Know, which was 2020. So what happened was, in my case, my heart surgery wasn't from a heart attack or arteriosclerosis or something like that. It wasn't from eating too much gravy, It was aortal stenosis, which is a narrowing of how well the heart aortal valve will work, which is a congenital condition which gets worse, and you can detect it sort of with a heart murmur as when in your 50s, and now that they can fix it, they usually have to fix it in your 60s, and that's exactly what happened to me. So I was beginning to really have symptoms maybe the year prior to 2014, and then in August of 2014, I had the surgery. So um, I was writing sequence and also this book right sort of during that and across it. And I would say sequence occurred mainly before it. But then when I just was regathering strength and was convalescing, I was kind of, stimulated to add things to it and to really get it created. And then I was hoping to publish. I never thought of publishing selected poems. So I was hoping to publish a new volume of poems with Nancy in 2018. They're so kind as to give me or require of me a rotation of a book every about 3 years. So I knew I had a publishing slot coming up, and it was this book, As Far as You Know, that I had ready to give them. But then they mandated at this point a selected poems. They had asked me for one repeatedly before, and I was always interested in a new book and a new book. So so this time they said, no, no, no. In fact, the contract arrived in the mail, and somebody had written in big black letters where it says title of work, selected poems. So I thought, okay, I give up. I'm going to be a good boy and do it, right? So, that book I was putting together with the help of my of Michael Redhill, the great novelist and poet himself, and playwright and everything, man of letters, who acted as my editor. He was so kind as to do it, and that was a wonderful experience. Putting that together right when these other books were in play for me, although it itself, the big selected poems, the poems in it are not affected by this, but it was part of that whole roiling of things that were affected by the heart operation. So what happened was sequence was written before, but had some revisions and final makings of it and a rearrangement and so on and perfectings of it after. As far as you know, was mainly an aftermath of the heart operation, and I've dated the poems, and you'll see most of them go from 2015, 2016, 2017. I've kept it in a kind of diaristic order, but I've included a few poems that were from earlier, just three or four or five that were from earlier years that I felt went with this book. So that's how that all happened.
And in particular, there's a section in the book, "The Art of Surgery," which you described in your afterwards, it came sort of a profound experience of being in the hospital, isn't that right? Of watching the various health practitioners on a kind of a humanist level, I would say.
Yeah, that's right. This book is equipped with a prose afterword. I usually don't put any kind of prose into my books, but I wrote a short essay in this. When I looked at that little section called Art of Surgery, and I read the poem Art of Surgery, I realized it really doesn't say much about me being in the hospital. Yeah, in fact, you have to read the poem right to the end and grasp all the implications to even realize that the speaker himself is going through an operation. It's a pretty the idea of it, or the basic occasion of it, is pretty refined into symbolism or thought in that poem or emotion. So I equipped this with this prose afterward in order to try to say something that I also wanted to say rather concretely about this experience. It wasn't, again, really about me, any kind of suffering or fear I had. That's more in the poem, in a kind of symbolized fashion. But I wanted to say something about the experience of being in bureaucratic, institutionalized, technologized medicine and the conflict or convergence in it of the humanity of people, the patient, but especially the caregivers and the doctors, on the one hand, with the technological system on the other hand. And I think that's one of the issues in the book, but it's always been one of the issues in my poetry, how in the modern age, one of the forms of the rupture we're forced to undergo is that we have to look at ourselves. I mean, we may not want to, we may not believe in it, we may fight it, but we're condemned by what we can't help knowing, can't help being scientific people, totally born within and awash in a scientific worldview. We can't help looking at ourselves from outside as though we're an object in a sort of inferior machine. And we can't help wondering what's going on in there and thinking if we could only know, if we could have some kind of better CAT scan or some kind of Star Trek medicine, which someday will be perfect. And on the other hand, that takes us away from living our own lives with our own feelings and our own sensations, and actually uh, meeting other people as flesh and blood people with their immediate experience. And medicine that's called an art and a science really is a place where there's almost a terrible, a very moving, but a very violent convergence and tearing of these things in that activity of medicine. Modern medicine works to prevent you being human and being regarded as a human being, but the doctor, the nurse, the caregiver have to be human with you, or you hope they will be, that they won't be robotized. And boy, do you find them working and working to be so, to be being generous and human and humane and personal, and yet against terrible, uh, headwinds of the system
And
and of the
I
technology.
think that section plays out in the sort of general central tension of your work, which I would conjecture is sort of, the state of civilization and society and the self. And I often think that there's a backdrop of a sense of an ideal, a contrast between a kind of a failed Eden, an original state of order and equilibrium that has been disrupted and become, as you're writing, the glimpse, the world as it is. And that tension between, what society can be on a humanist level and where it maybe has drifted in and had to work itself through the reality of the world comes through not only in those hospital poems, in a number of the poems where you see this Edenic backdrop. You know, you read the one about the campfire. There's other poems that have that context. Even the opening poem, Terrorism, which has that sort of the ominous appearance of the plains, is set within a backdrop of the, you know, sort of this almost bucolic, the birds flying about. Is that a conscious tension that you're building on in some ways?
Yes, I think it's a felt tension, first of all, that has become conscious. You know, my own anthropology or psychology believes that, yes, it is possible to know too much, to become too analytical and too conscious, and to desiccate your creativity and your feelings. However, if you are a well balanced person, really rooted in your creativity, then to get more and more conscious can only be a good thing, because it can never kill the unconsciousness. What it does is it brings it up to a higher level. It kind of, you don't stay at the first level of your unconsciousness. By making what was the first level now conscious, you reveal deeper levels and deeper levels. So that's sort of what I see as one of the ways of looking at the work of poetry. So yes, I absolutely think that I have a background sense of Eden. That's why I always talk about childhood. I, I find myself very similar to William Blake in this way, with his idea of innocence. The human being has innocence. Innocence is the great reality. Experience, what he calls experience, adult and technical and so forth, a realization, a highly rationalized consciousness, and everything that it brings with it, from personal envy to the desire for conquest and empire and so on, all of that is secondary. We seem to automatically develop it, so we have to go through it. But its really only goal is to come back to a higher innocence, or a restored but broadened and deepened and made more powerful innocence, which will reabsorb experience. And I do believe, or want to believe, in that structure of the self. So I believe in the kind of myth making that is in the great poets from Blake to Octavio Paz, let's say, in which they're fully aware that this myth necessarily has a temporal structure. It has to be a story with a beginning and an end. So it starts in the beautiful place. But it indicates, as Paz says so strongly with this idea of the source, that this isn't really a before and an after. It is an always possible and a what man has made of man. You know, you could say the poet Burns gives us the phrase, what man has made of man. And a little later in the same century, the poet Hopkins gives us the phrase there, for all that, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. That dearest freshness is always there despite what man has made of man. And every moment and every poem should be to go back to it. And yet we find, because to a certain extent at least, we're in the prison house of experience, the poem tends to be a battle between innocence and experience rather than pure innocence. And it's always expressing a desire which it achieves only in passages, only in images, only in moments, to re-establish the, the purity of, and the totality of what the human being could be. So this is definitely a layout of experience, or a vision of experience, that I profoundly have. And I think, you know, maybe it takes me saying it in this way, but I think then anybody who would then open any book of mine and read 10 lines would find it expressed. It's everywhere.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and as you're talking about it, I'm thinking of the distinction I think that Northrop Frye made between the Edenic and the utopian. That you know, one is looking back to an innocent time as a sort of level of nostalgia, whereas the utopia is looking forward to a refreshed and prepared society. And do you think that your sort of your project in some ways is sort of working within those parameters? Do you see your poem somewhere on that scale in that distinction?
Yeah, I think so. I just talked about transforming your idea of myth into something that isn't just historical, as if there really was this exact timeline, but something, to use a big word, ontological, something about the structure of being, which is always present in each moment. Corruption, but also freshness and beauty, and the possibility of bringing the freshness and beauty to the aid and the correction of the corruption. Well, the same thing is true of ideas like our idea of progress. That's another myth. And I'm firmly a believer that let's have progress as a honorific word. I love the word progress, that's fine. But inventing new things, like having had sailing ships and now having steamships, or getting to the moon, does not qualify for the honorific term progress. What qualifies only for the honorific term progress is to be better, to be more creative, to have your impulses to love and to create beauty and harmony and togetherness, and to, well, as Czesław Miłosz says, to have everything stand in the glow of ripeness, everything, to take that feeling that you do have and make it more of you and more of what you give to the earth, and have the evil or the closed or unhelpful things be less and less, right? To have your energy more in the good and less in the evil. That alone is progress. That alone deserves honorific
It
title of
sounds like you're a
progress.
stoic, Al.
In a way, well, that's a good question, right? So, but anyway, the thing I wanted to say is I want to install both Fry's Edenic and his utopian in the moment, in the right now. Both the myth going back to the past and finding refreshment and hope there, and the ideology of progress looking to a better future, is something that is best thought of as what we can do right now. And when you think of it that way, the two things are profoundly linked. They're one. And there's nothing wrong then with nostalgia. Nostalgia means pain of home, a home sickness. But it doesn't have to be that. It can be the preservation of a good hope and a good thing as a tool and a seed for the future. So there's, in my book, I talk about the tiny pomegranate seeds that Ceres gave that Demeter gave to Persephone, right? To make sure she could come back to the earth. Yeah. So sorry, am I a stoic? I do seem to have a view of fate. I don't know, but
Right.
yeah,
But
I think of a
also the sense of that the main thing is virtue and when you talk about progress, it's not about, as you say, getting to the moon. It's about living your life at a certain ethical level, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with that. I get suspicious of words like ethics or anything like that, suspicious of any kind of rationalism, because, you know, so what you find today among, people who pat themselves on the back for being advanced thinkers, at the forefront of theory and being theoretically sophisticated and so forth, it would be a rejection of humanism. And then they'd look at the kind of thing I said and they'd call it humanism. This is just taking things and putting them in historical boxes so you can dismiss them. It might be theoretically sophisticated, but it's sociologically naive. You're totally failing to observe that all you're doing is categorizing certain things so you can take their place by asserting that you've got some idea that is newer, whereas usually it's not newer at all. And usually it's somewhat gimcrack. No, what I'm saying, I think, is a primordial poetic vision. which is constantly flowing into philosophies like humanism, into religions, and into the renovation of religions to get them to go back to the poetic vision that was at the source of them, but that they always corrupt into various kinds of practices and laws and so forth. So, this poetic vision is something that's always new, and yes, it's in humanism, but it's in all kinds of other isms too. And the one of the main corrupting things that you find mysteriously in the human soul is to always take that vision and then for the interpreters and the users to come and make it into theories and deep six the poetry that actually is it and claim the center stage for themselves. Blake, in some of his satirical works, bitterly denounces this and says, to the interpreters, yes, a certain kind of wisdom writers of today or philosophers can write some good things, but somebody who could, he says, somebody who could truly understand Shakespeare would know an infinite number of those same types of good things. Exactly right. Something like a theory like let's say the something like the Oedipus complex. The Oedipus complex is a great example. That's a theory for a civilization that has forgotten how to read poetry, so it can translate into abstract rationalistic terms some little part of what you can find in Sophocles. But anybody who can read Sophocles will not only be able to find 20 Oedipus theories about many, many different zones of the universe, but will see the unity of all those things and will be saved from the partiality and rationalism of the Oedipus theory.
Well, so to get to your poetic vision, I want to talk about the poem Silence and Song, which, and maybe we can talk a little bit, and maybe I can get you to read it. I see it's sort of as a keystone poem in this collection. Perhaps they're part of the essential riddle of your work. You approach Silence and Song through themes of art and the mystical in the poem. You say that, in paintings a divinity lives. And just in the poem Terrorism, where you refer to the great Robertson Jeffers line, darkness and silence, the two eyes that see God, or in before definition, you write, first in the mind there should be no words. What does this silence signify to you?
Well, first of all, silence is itself a word, and so it partly indicates and partly participates in a thing, something. Now, we don't know exactly if there's any silence, so we keep imagining it in various ways. So it seems to be at least a limit in our thought. Like if you think of our thought as a spectrum or a dial, silence is one extreme edge of it, as maybe noise or music would be the other extreme edge or end of it, the evil or good form of the other extreme end of it. So I'm always thinking about the relationship of poetry and the word to silence and music. And often silence for me is painting. So painting is a poem with no words that makes no noise. I think one of the best ways to experience silence is, just have in the back of your mind for a moment, talking, conversing, or reading a poem or something like that, and then look at a painting, and then try to examine your experience. Well, there might have been, you're standing in a museum, there's various kinds of noise all around you. There wasn't any silence. But vis a vis the experience of the words, there's total silence. And you suddenly understand what silence means. And then I The other thing I think about this is I want to attack the whole notion, which is profound in certain kinds of thinking, of the superiority of silence, which is related to the idea of the inadequacy of words. Well, words are certainly inadequate in a way, but in other ways they're perfectly adequate. And people don't, it's just not as trendy to focus on today. And silence isn't um, a, another entity superior to words, as if they're two separate armies or one big ball and one small ball. They're part and parcel of each other. And the words express the silence, and the silence express the words. You could understand this from the human act. Poetry has the dignity and honor of being words that are actions. A good poem is always an action. So it might not make a physical act with somebody's body immediately, but it will do so. The same way with an act. If you go and hug a beggar and give him $5 and don't say a word, that's just an act. But that act can't come out of itself, and it can't reveal what it means until ultimately, from someone, whether the actor himself or someone else, it has a word. The act needs the word needs the act. And they're not really separate from each other. The great philosopher John Dewey pointed out that the body needs many things which are beyond the boundary of the body, and thus they have to be thought of as belonging to the body. I mean, these include air and food. That's the kind of relationship that the act and the word, that silence and poetry have to each other.
So, in the sense, in the context of poetry, do you see silence as sort of a state of pre-articulation? Is it a well in which we draw creation or expression out of?
Yeah, well, exactly, exactly. It's the moment of experiencing, which is one phase of the poem. It's not so. It isn't any words yet. It might not even be an articulatable idea yet. It's just simply a being with, a being there, or even a being beyond being there. But it's on a continuum with, and it will express itself in and return to the other form, and return from the other form into the first form. You know. Yeah.
Could I get you to read the poem?
Yes, I certainly can. You're very wise to point out too the connection that it has to the poem uh, before definition, which is quite later in the book. And the book is held together by these kinds of threads that go across it. You can see why one poem follows another, but you will also see, looking through the book, they keep echoing each other from far across the book. Right? So, but the poem Silence and Song goes like this. In paintings a divinity lives, an aspect and presence of divinity, the silence. Gratefully the body drinks it through the eyes. They see it's a member of the body beyond the skin, missing member, how long missed. Without it long the body dies. Quiet water, empty shelter waiting far off across a plain, like towers or just a ruined wall, and the vast early evening that encloses them, far off and long before the tired traveler drawing near can hear the bees swarm in the lavender fields and cattle lowing near the falls. Divine silence of the poem, silence it gathers and becomes as it comes to be known. In its moment of being known, it turns to a painting where the world is gathered in the form of a ship coming into harbor far beneath us from the mouth of sunset. The silent poem, the moment of repose, before the mind changing throws the verses down into strangeness. Then their silent God, once more invisible, has to go back to singing to be heard again. So that's a pretty complex poem. I usually don't read it aloud because I hope it sounds beautiful, but on the other hand, to follow all the changes in it is a little hard just in the hearing. But I'll just sort of say that a basic idea is you read a poem, let's say Moby Dick. So that is a big, long thing, takes you a long time to read, and you better read it about 5 times before you've really read it. Suddenly it goes silent because suddenly you see the whole thing. And that's your way of grasping it. But then it slips out of that, and you have to go back and read it again and recapture the vision, and you will again in another way. And if you're in noise all the time, you're never in the vision, or you're never just resting before reading, as it says up high in the poem, without the silence, the body dies. You won't be able to achieve if you keep just busy all the time. You've got to first be before the achievement, and then as a result of the achievement, you've got to grasp the achievement in a silent totality, which you see through the metaphor of sight, the way you see a whole scene quietly, and then you have to go back into the metaphor of traveling through it. That would be a language of moving.
Well, I'm drawn to the transformational aspect that's happening within the poem that you're enacting. That it starts out as something, and then it goes through this period of contemplation, and then transforms and re-energizes itself to some degree. I mean, and the other aspect of that silence that we've been talking about is the idea of song, which is something that appears throughout your work, and is song. What does that mean to you? It seems to be at the root of the silence, that it's the other end of that, but they're not really that exact dichotomy. They're part and parcel of each other, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think so. The Czeslaw Miłosz, in his book The Land of Ulro, which is a title he obviously took from William Blake, has an essay, or a portion of an essay, in which he talks about his great cousin, Oscar Miłosz, the French symbolist poet, a wonderful, wonderful poet. And he quotes something by Oscar Miłosz, in which Oscar says that music and poetry started out together. They are two beautiful sisters, but as it happened, they had to part. Miłosz is thinking of the inevitably conceptual nature of words. So although they're sound, and although you can even make the point, as I often do brattily make in the face of music, that they're the best music, the sound of the human voice and human words is the best music and the best instrument, nonetheless, it is inevitably conceptual in a foreground way. You could put it this way: people make the mistake, and they like to make the mistake because they don't want poetry to be something superior, that it's just another form of discourse. It's just something else in words, like an essay or a magazine article or a book of theory or philosophy or something like that. Well, this is totally untrue. This is just complete misconception. Poetry is an art whose material is words, just the way, I don't know, pot making is an art whose material is clay. You take words and you make something out of it. And your goal, just like the potter or the sculptor, is to form it into something beautiful and meaningful in a way that is ultimately mute, ultimately unsayable except by looking at the thing, which you can then stand in the room of the museum and depart so that neither you nor anyone can say anything for certain about it ever again. But when somebody else goes into the museum room, they can look at it and enjoy it and grasp it. I don't say get it, understand it, I say grasp it. See it all around from the angle they're now in. Perhaps later walk around to another angle and see another part of it that they didn't even know was there. Begin getting a whole view of it. That's what a poem is. But the words are inevitably conceptual. So what you're working with to make this art is everything that is in concepts. It's not just the tactile, sensual, and say emotional content of words, but even the emotions are part and parcel of our concepts. And poems are filled with stories arranged like we arrange stories. They're full of arguments arranged like we make arguments. They're full of all the references to all the ideas we have. They're all full of the poet himself thinking he's a philosopher and rolling out his own ideas and so on. All these things are in poetry. But so all these conceptual things, but as long as the poem stays a true poem, all of those things in it never define it. They're just bricks in the wall of it. They're just, scraps in the collage of it. And so Oscar Miłosz was thinking of the idea that music kind of retains a pure essence, relatively speaking, of the poetic vision, whereas the poem has to wrap the totality of everything that words can refer to, representationally, conceptually, and everything that has to do with the arguments over words. Are they representational? Can they communicate anything? All of that stuff goes into the poem. I think poets always ought to remember when they hear somebody saying, well, language can't communicate. Language fails us. Language can't really represent reality and grasp reality. What they should remember is you aren't subordinate to any of those ideas. They're just part of what you're talking about in your poem. And in any good poem you write, they're only one part. They're in there with many other emotions, many other experiences, and they're part of the problems that the human being has come to today and suffers today. You know, you might say that the poet is crucified on theory, but he's a person. You know?
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me you're saying that the undefinable, like you can approach it through art, but it almost can't be touched entirely. That's where song and silence sort of, I guess, meet in some ways. I mean, what you were saying about Miłosz, I was thinking it's similar to George Steiner talked about music and how, really it's just sounds through time, and the only time you can experience music is when it's being played, and then once the song is finished, it disappears. It's completely ethereal, and so it can only be experienced while it's being enacted. And in some ways, that's the same way I think with what you're saying with the poem, is that all of those building blocks of words are kind of capturing a ethereal feeling, but they obviously aren't that feeling.
Yeah, well, I would think that that's very true. What you say really is part of the way I think, and it has many different sort of exits from it into, related ideas or ways I'd explain it, or discuss it. For instance, I think almost every commentator who's gone into it deeply, every person who's contemplated poetry deeply, comes up with the notion that the poem is mysterious. It's not to be equated to the words of the poem. It needs the words of the poem, but kind of like the human soul, which can't, as far as we know, exist without the body, but is not limited to the body at all. so too the poem and the words of the poem. The poem came from somewhere, and in the writing of the poem, it developed that somewhere, that something that it came from, and it formed it, and you grasp it, but what exactly do you grasp? It escapes the writer at that point. It has somewhat of its own character because the words you use form it in a way that's they're contributed by language, not by you. Not that the author has no agency, but he doesn't have total agency. And then it goes off to be heard by somebody else. I mean, you can say this in a dumbhead way, even just about the poem in terms of some print on the page. If you want to look at the poem as the printed poem or the written poem as opposed to the spoken poem or the thought poem, where is it? Where is it? Is it the ink? Well, if there's no one to see the ink, what's the ink, right? So is it when I put it down? Or is it when you come and read it? And if I close the book and it's just lying in total darkness, where is it? Is it in there? You know, you even say it about a physical poem, right? So, so much more about the actual poem. So, that's one thing I think of with regard to that. There's various ones.
This brings me to another poem that I quite like in the book, the poem "To the Reader," which I think is particularly haunting. It's almost a raw evocation in the book. It seems to be a kind of a desperate plea for a human connection, another to kind of authenticate or make valid kind of a human experience. It seems to me mysterious in that way too, a kind of an existential plea. How did this poem arise? Was it directly related to an experience, or just encompassing a concern that arises in other poems in the book?
Yeah, it definitely is something that arises in other poems in the book, and it arises in my kind of confrontation with classical poetry and so on. You know, you can think of Shakespeare saying of his poetry, this lives and this gives life to thee, and you can think of Horace way back in the heyday of the Roman Empire saying, I have built myself a monument which will outlast the tombs of princes and so forth and so on. And in the modern obsession with and worry over time, this has come to be a rather intense, um, you know, um, series of thoughts or poetic works and philosophical works on the survival of the self in one's work. And obviously, what we were just saying with regard to silence and song um, links up with this. It seems to be two different topics, but as soon as you say, does one survive in one's effort? And you're not talking about just an echo in somebody's memory that lasted a couple of generations or something. You notice ghosts never go back any farther than usually about your grandmother's age because nobody can remember any farther than that. And the few other ghosts there are just attached to long-standing buildings and so on in which some historical record is preserved. So, so you're thinking, then what is the work? Say I write a book. Am I going to be so famous that everybody is going to remember it? And no, probably not. Then it'll be in a library somewhere, maybe if I'm lucky, like the Library of Babel, like Borges presents, and there'll be these infinite shelves. The internet already is a good realization of this fantasy or symbol of Borges's. And in there, all kinds of things are lost, never to be seen again. But you can imagine some time traveler in some infinite era wandering through these abandoned stacks of the library and taking down your book and for 15 minutes reading your poem. Is that your immortality? Or is your work something else? Is it something complete? It is something that is enabled and needed your physical work of producing poems and participating in society as your way of sending them out and contacting people and responding to people. But on the other hand, when you die, um, and are separated from it, that kind of work, somehow what you've done, well, what continues or maintains is just there as a permanent reality that occurred. Um, so I think something like To the Reader is about that. And it's about the voices trying to imagine, oh, I don't know, being spiritually independent and confident in that way, and at the same time feeling no, I desperately need someone to read me. I need someone to keep me alive. I have to be present in human society. Um, so this poem To the Reader is on page 41, and on page 84, there's another poem called Descent to the Dead, which is basically the same poem, just from a different viewpoint. To the Reader has the poet begging the reader, please read me so that I can live, right? And
Yes,
Descent to the
I
Dead.
jotted down the line, Descent to the Dead. Insofar as I transform myself into my song, I can live again forever. It,
Yeah.
yeah, it leans.
Yeah, but the final point of that poem is the poem that the poet telling the reader this time, you won't live unless you come down and read me. Not because you have to read me particularly, but because if you don't enact this um, honor of things, including of the past, and revive it and honor it in yourself, symbolized by being a reader and reading a book, if you don't do that, you aren't fully alive and you will not live.
Well, Al, I've got about 20 more questions for you, but I think we probably should wrap this up. Could I ask you to read the To the Reader poem to wrap things up? Would that be all right?
I would love to. That would be good. Now, I want to say I really like this poem. And on the other hand, I want to point out in advance, as a little footnote, that in the middle of it, there is the image of coming upon a willow tree. And you know how they are in these big stems, big 3 or 4 trunks sometimes, and you often see them. One of them has cracked and fallen. So that happens in the middle of the poem. So you have to not get distracted by that. You have to realize you're going to come back to the main theme. All right. Let's say, To the Reader. This prayer I write as a poem because I know very well I do not pray. A broken willow reflects in the pool the river partly turns aside to and enters here just for a moment. One of its great stems is fallen in the water, a sign of a century's damage which finally killed, a leaving this May of a February storm. Or maybe just of a quiet culmination, a crack, a slump with no one to see or hear after decades of seasons, the arrived sum of the events of a long flourishing and failing. It broke, and now it lies in my gaze with the rest of the beauty there, in the quiet commotion of memory and thought. Who can this anxiousness be addressed to but you? A prayer should signify a God, but even so little as you may not be there. You will have to read this poem to exist. And what it signifies, the agglomeration of a moment belonging to someone else, can it be anything for you? I beg you, a person like me, baffled like me, content in the intervals between the peaks of terror, to go on my way, I beg you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Al. What was the significance of the? I saw the willow as the sort of broken branch as sort of a something to set off the contemplative moment. What was the significance for you for that being in there?
We reason about these things with the later reasons, as Wallace Stevens. I can put it together afterwards. The simplest thing I'd say first, though, is even, some of my poems clearly have some autobiography in them. Others seem very impersonal. Mostly they seem impersonal. But you'll often find, if you ask me, that they have moments of autobiography in them. And that's one. I'm just out prowling around in the woods and I come across this. How beautiful and how thought provoking. In retrospect, it seems as if it was an image, and the way I've expressed it makes it an image for the person contemplating the totality of his own life. He sees in the willow, which still lives but is cracked and falling and part of it dying, its history when it was a young tree and then a mature tree overhanging the thing, and now the cracking and falling of a part of it, and ultimately its total demise, or it's turning into just stolps, in the woods, right? Snags in the woods and in the water. And so it's a little image, like in a traditional romantic or ancient poem. The so-called paysage moralisé, the landscape given a symbolic meaning, right? The little landscape of the willow tree and the pool fed by the passing stream, and so it's its seclusion, its aloneness, its awareness of itself as an individual, and the totality in this little bubble of thought or realization of its childhood, its youth and maturity, its aging, its death, right? And that's sort of one aspect of the poem. Then the that's the middle of the poem, sort of, and the poem obviously gets made out of the tree. If I look back at it, I think probably the whole skein of thought was stimulated by looking at the tree. I thought, I'm writing a poem about this tree in my head or in my heart without any words yet. Then I'm wishing someone would read it. Will this poem be all alone with me forever? Beyond just the beauty of the action of making it and me totally alone with this tree. Um, what will it be as part of me in the human family, and then the human family across the ages? And then I must have come to the emotion of saying, how can I actually ever want anybody who's got his own life to live to pay attention to this experience of mine and this little piece of art of mine? But what am I doing, and what are we all doing, that begging each other that we would all pay this attention, impossible or illogical as it must be? Somewhere beyond logic and possibility, it must be a superior reality. So that would be maybe the totality of the poem, right?
Yeah. And that goes back to the superior reality, that whole idea of the Edenic, etc. So,
Yes,
well,
very
listen,
much so.
yeah, thank you so much. Congrats on another wonderful book, as far as you know, which is out House Financy Press. And
Yeah,
thank
let me
you
hold up
for
the
joining
hardbound
us.
version.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, there we go.
There's a hardbound
Nice.
copy.
And thanks for
Yeah.
joining us for the Ottawa International Writers Festival and VerseFest, this co-production. It's been great talking to you.
It's same here, David. Thanks. It's been a great honor to participate, and I've loved the questions. Have been very stimulating to me. Obviously, allowed me to trot out a lot of my hobby horses, which need exercise.
And hopefully we'll be able to meet over a real beer sometime in the near
Yes.
future.
There's nothing sadder than virtual beer. It's true.
Right. All right. Thanks again.
Okay. Thank you, David. Ciao.